I rarely do this kind of video, you know, this calling out of somebody in particular. I'm just not into that kind of drama. But I'm doing this video about Tom Nash. Tom Nash is a YouTube analyst. He's got a couple of 100,000 subscribers, and he's a big boy. He's a financial analyst who's become a YouTuber, and he's very successful at it. Good on him. But I just have to say that he just put out a video just now that is so colossally full of shit that I just have to call him out. I just have to say it. I mean, my intellectual self-respect demands that I call him out, because he's claiming that there isn't going to be any hyperinflation, and anybody who claims that there might be is completely wrong and doesn't know anything about macroeconomics and is a complete and utter fool. And then he gives absolutely no reason for his conclusions. Yeah, he's just basically positing that there isn't going to be any hyperinflation. And the reason that he gives it is the most idiotic. I mean, he does give a reason. And he claims that the reason that there isn't going to be hyperinflation of the US dollar, that the dollar is always going to be rock steady, is because Jerome Powell, who is currently the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, well, he will never raise interest rates. He will always, you know exactly when and if to raise interest rates. And he's already said that he's not going to pull the trigger too early in terms of raising interest rates to halt the galloping inflation that we currently are experiencing. Yeah, because at this time, see, the United States dollar is inflating at roughly 4%, at least officially. Now, you go over and talk to, say, John Williams at Shadow Stats, and he's going to give you a completely different number. Shadow Stats by John Williams, he's a guy, you know, sets up this website that basically analyzes prices based on the old basket of goods and services. Because the basket of goods and services changed back in the 90s, I believe, because they wanted to not have to readjust Social Security as quickly as inflation, so they basically tweaked the inflation numbers so that registered inflation would not be so high, okay? And therefore, the Social Security payments would not have to be readjusted so much. It was basically a way to save something like, I don't know, something like $300 billion over a 10-year period. That was basically the rationale for that, but that's not important. The important thing is that, see, different people, reasonable people, think that inflation is a lot higher. Now, the fact of the matter is, we see in certain goods and services that inflation is galloping along. We see it insofar as lumber prices, gasoline prices. I myself have been noticing this among my friends. Yeah, I've spoken to 3 friends who work white-collar jobs, a couple bankers and one in a high-end consulting firm. And they've all been offered bumps in their salary, and not just little bumps. I'm talking like 50%. The consultant was offered a bump to jump ship to another consulting firm, and the bump was 40% net salary plus a signing bonus. And at these investment banks, same thing. It was 50 and 60% respectively, plus signing bonuses, okay? And these are buddies that were kind of like surprised that they were getting these offers. I mean, basically, higher wages are on the way. And we're seeing it not only on high-end wages, but we're also seeing it insofar as low wages. And we're seeing the problem of a lot of fast food joints, restaurants and whatnot, are not able to hire any people because nobody wants to take the jobs because they're getting paid to stay at home. And so labor prices are rising across the board. Okay, those are realities on the ground that Tom Nash doesn't even talk about, okay? But what he does talk about is that he says that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Jerome Powell, he isn't going to raise interest rates, and he's told the markets that he's very aware of how sensitive they are to hikes in interest rates. Well, yeah, of course he's going to say that, but the fact is he's very aware that at this time, the U.S. federal government spends on a yearly basis, as of 2021, it spends roughly, well, it depends how you measure it, but between $300 and $350 billion per year on interest payments, okay? And the interest rates are at historic lows. What would happen to the federal budget if interest rates rose and the yields on all that debt were to rise? Would they be able to meet those obligations? No, they would not. In point of fact, the federal government would be in a position of potentially defaulting on its debt. The Treasury bond, the benchmark debt instrument of the economy, would default. And that's the truth. So you see, it's not that Jerome Powell is claiming that he's not going to raise interest rates until just the right moment. It's that he can't. He cannot raise interest rates. And this is what Tom Nash doesn't seem to get. And in his bullshit little video, he claims that anybody who claims that the dollar might hyperinflate into oblivion doesn't know what they're talking about. Au contraire, Tom. I know exactly what the fuck I'm talking about. And the fact is, Jerome Powell cannot raise interest rates, because if he were to do so, he would bankrupt the US federal government. The US federal government would not have the means to meet its interest payments on its current debt. Now, Tom Nash also talks about the fact that he grew up in Russia. I actually know Russia. I live here in Ukraine, you know, literally a stone's throw away from Russia. And I'm going to be going there shortly on business and whatnot. But the point, he talks about how in the early 90s there was hyperinflation in Russia, which is true. Now, he talks about it, but he doesn't draw any lessons from it. Now, in my own case, my family is from Chile, and I grew up with all kinds of stories about hyperinflation in Chile in the early 70s when we had a communist government. It's socialist communist, it's not important, but the thing is, see, they crashed the economy, like all these fucking socialists always do. And not only did they crash the economy, they crashed the currency. And the escudo, as it was called in Chile, well, it suffered, at the end, it was something like 120% inflation year over year. I mean, it was a fucking disaster. And people, in the end, they had to resort to using dollars because that was the hard currency. They couldn't depend on the escudo because some months, you know, the inflation was so high that it was just not worth it. And not only was inflation high, but there weren't any goods and services available except on the black market. So in many ways, the official inflation was just 110% per year, but the unofficial rate, since you could only buy on the black market, well, it was closer to 250 to 350% per year. Okay? Now, I personally didn't live at that time because we were living outside of the United States, outside of Chile at the time. But, you know, as soon as we moved back to Chile, I heard all these stories. I grew up with these stories. It was traumatic, okay? And so I remember that story. And the other story I remember very well is that the 1980s, the early 1980s. See, I was born in 1968. I was born the son of a banker. And in 1979, we were living in New York. My dad was working in, down in Manhattan, of course. And in January of 79, the Shah of Iran was overthrown. And that meant the interruption of the supply of oil. And because of that, oil shot up precipitously. And this sparked an inflation, a wave of inflation that I remember very clearly, because my dad, since I was at the time, 11, 12-year-old boy, my dad would tell me all about it, the blow by blow as it was happening. Retrospectively, I realized what was going on. My dad was telling me all that was going on as a way for him to talk his way through how he was going to handle this crisis, because it was a huge fucking crisis. And what happened was that, see, the dollar started to inflate away in 79 and into 1980. And the only reason that the dollar did not break in 1980 and 81 was because of Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board at that time. Paul Volcker realized what was going on, and so he pulled the trigger, in Tom Nash's phrase. He hiked interest rates, and he hiked them by a lot. Inflation was, at that time, as Nash correctly points out, roughly 15%, but that doesn't tell the whole story. What was going on was that, see, the dollar was circling the drain. It was spiraling out of control. Prices were rising precipitously month by month, week by week. The fact that the Hunt brothers at the time tried to corner the silver market, but gold shot to the moon precisely because of these inflation fears. The whole thing was starting to collapse. The dollar was starting to collapse. And so what did Paul Volcker do? He raised interest rates to 21%. The Fed funds rate was raised to 21%. I mean, that cut inflation in its fucking tracks, and it broke the economy. The United States economy went into a severe recession because of it. Because when you hike up interest rates, credit dries up because people can't afford to take out loans at 21%. It's just too much. Their businesses don't yield enough to cover such an interest rate. And since they can't take out loans to start new businesses, they don't start new businesses. And so they start to, either holding steady or more likely cutting out people to save money to pay for these higher interest rates in whatever aspect of their business they currently have, okay? You hike interest rates to that kind of a level, and it's just slamming the foot brakes and the hand brakes on the economy, hitting them with full force. And that was the only way that Paul Volcker could halt the runaway inflation that was afflicting the US dollar. Now, of course, he could do this because the United States wasn't so indebted. The federal government, I mean. The United States federal government was in deficit spending, of course, and had a debt, was carrying a debt, but it was not that severe. The United States right now has between $300 and $350 billion in interest payments per year. What is the interest payment percentage-wise? Well, interest rates right now are historic lows. The yield on the 10-year bond is what, 1.5%? See, at a trivial interest rate, the federal government has to shell out between $300 and $350 billion per year to just service its debt. Now, what do you think would happen if inflation starts to run away and somebody like Paul Volcker, with the balls of Paul Volcker, were to hit the brakes full on and just raise interest rates enough to halt that inflation? Raise it, say, as Paul Volcker did, at least 500 basis points above the current pace of inflation, which is basically what Volcker did. What would happen to the federal government? Would it be able to make its interest payments? No, it would not. It would not be able to. Right now, at 300 to 350 billion per year, at a trivial interest rate, I mean, it's quite a chunk out of the federal revenues. If I recall correctly the numbers, and correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe that the interest payments account for, at this time, something like 9% of federal government income, roughly 5% of federal government outlays. I mean, that's what we're talking about, okay? And at a trivial interest rate. So if interest rates had to be raised in order to halt inflation, the US federal government would go bankrupt. And see, we who are watching the markets, we who are investors, we who are not fucking morons, as this Tom Nash person seems to think we are, well, we're scared. Of course, because we see that whatever Jerome Powell is saying, and Jerome Powell is the biggest fucking idiot since, since God knows when. I mean, he's the dumbest Federal Reserve Board chairman in quite some time. Well, whatever he says is meaningless because we all know that he cannot raise interest rates enough to halt inflation. He can't. And all this talk, everybody's claiming that this spurt of inflation is temporary as the economy gets back up to speed after the pandemic. But what if this is a permanent situation? Well, more to the point, what if this price hike in terms of labor costs and commodity prices not only is permanent, but continues on, going up and up and up, and accelerates? What happens then? See, there's a very clever metaphor about inflation. See, inflation is like, imagine you're at a stadium, right? And you're watching a football game, and you're high up in the stands. And you got a guy in front of you who's got like a big head, say, or a large hairdo or something, right? And so you want to see it better. So what do? You stand up. You stand up to get a better view of the field down below, right? But what happens to the people behind you? Well, they stand up too now, don't they? Because since you're standing up, you're blocking their view, so they stand up so that they can get a better view. And this happens throughout the whole stadium. And what happens if hypothetically, in this hypothetical stadium, everybody has a little stepladder? And so, I pull out my stepladder because all of a sudden everybody's standing up, including the guy in front of me who had the big head, who started this off. And what do? I put my little stepladder and climb on top of it to get a better view. And so everybody else starts doing the same thing. And on and on and on it goes. You see? And the only way to halt this is to raise interest rates hard enough and fast enough to cut inflation at the knees. I'm mixing my metaphors, but you know what I mean, okay? Now, it's clear that Jerome Powell will never raise interest rates. First of all, he doesn't have the balls to do it, and secondly, and much more importantly, he realizes that if he were to do so, he would bankrupt the federal government. And we who are watching this, we understand this. We understand that Jerome Powell will never raise interest rates, ever, because the federal government would default. That's what would happen. And so there are two possibilities. Either interest rates remain the same and prices continue to spiral out of control, going up and up and up and up, and people borrowing more money to pay for the higher labor costs, to pay for increased commodity prices. And this inflationary spiral just keeps on going up and up and up with no end in sight. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility, Jerome Powell actually does raise interest rates, but creates some sort of mechanism, some special window for the federal government, and basically gives the federal government money, prints up money, as they've done, prints up money, and they call it quantitative, quantitative treasury assistance or some shit like that. Something really clever. Because these fuckers are always great at coming up with really clever names for what is essentially printing. They come up with some special window, some discount window for the federal government and start putting out money to the federal government. And the federal government uses this money to pay off the higher interest rate on its debt, and also throw out more free money to people who are finding it harder and harder to pay for things because they're unemployed. Because by raising interest rates, so many businesses shut down and stopped operations and put people out on the street. So you see what I'm saying? See, whatever happens, or let me phrase that, whatever reasonable measure is taken, either hiking interest rates to stop inflation or not hiking interest rates and letting inflation keep on going as it will, either way, either outcome ends in the dollar quickly spiraling, prices going up and up and up and up, the dollar losing value. Now, this is reasonable. And I don't understand why this Nash person, basically just said a lot of bullshit and said that we don't know what we're talking about. Fucking A, we know what we're talking about. And we're fucking worried. And if he can't take it seriously, then he should shut the fuck up. I mean, I'm saying this directly to him because I thought his attitude was so fucking arrogant. See, I come from Russia. I saw hyperinflation. I know what I'm talking about. Hyperinflation won't happen. Shut up and go away. Fuck you. I too know from not personal experience, but family experience what hyperinflation is like. And I saw what happened in 80, 81, and how the only way to stop the spiraling inflation because of the oil crisis of 79 was to hike interest rates the way Paul Volcker did, okay? I mean, I was lucky because I got a front seat tutorial to somebody who was neck deep in that shit. My old man, who was, like I said, a banker. So I just want to tell this guy, Tom Nash, the gauntlet has been thrown. See? I mean, I'm discussing this particular issue insofar as hyperinflation is concerned and the economic outlook into the future on my Patreon channel to my Patreon subscribers who really care about it. But I just had to put this video out there because it just so pisses me off when you have cheerleaders who swallow the mainstream narrative line thoughtlessly and claim that they're going to give you an explanation as to why they think as they do, and in the end there's no explanation at all. It's just wishful thinking. And to this Tom Nash guy, I don't know him. I don't have any beef with the guy on a personal level, but I just have to say, man, don't be so fucking arrogant to act like you know shit when you don't know fuck all. about something really fucking important that's happening, and you're swallowing the bullshit line of the mainstream narrative. And look where that's gotten us over the last fucking year. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like my work, please check out my Patreon channel. Link is in the description below. I put out an extra video there that you'll find nowhere else, usually on topics that are a bit too controversial for YouTube, and that's pretty much everything that's interesting nowadays. But anyway, I also do a Sunday call-in show. It's a live broadcast, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. So please check it out. Thank you so much, and I will catch you next time.